Try again. Good afternoon. That's better. I'm Eric Beinhacker. I'm the director of the Institute for New Economic Thinking at the Oxford Martin School. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you and to introduce our speaker, Sir Tony Atkinson. Now, just before I get into the introduction, I've been asked to take care of a few housekeeping items, which are the usual ones. If you have a mobile phone, which everyone probably does, please check that it's on silent. And second, if there is any kind of an emergency, the exits are out the back where you came in. And also lastly, if anyone is standing in the back or looking for a seat, there are still seats up front. Don't be shy. Please come on down up front and fill up the seats up here. Now, I'm not going to spend very much time on Tony's glittering biography, much of which is actually probably familiar to many people here this afternoon. But I'll briefly note that among Tony's many honors, he's a fellow of the British Academy, and at one time or another, he's held the presidency of just about every important economics body, including the Royal Economic Society, the Econometric Society, the European Economic Association, and the International Economic Association. And he also spent a decade serving as the warden of Nuffield College here in Oxford. He's currently the Centennial Professor at the London School of Economics, and we're also very proud to say that he's one of the founding members of INET at Oxford, our research center here. Now, Tony's subject tonight is economic inequality, and it's a subject that Tony has been conducting path-breaking research on for decades. In fact, one could say that virtually every significant scholar working in the topic today has at one time or another either been a student, a postdoc, or a collaborator of Tony's. And his influence on the field would be actually hard to exaggerate. But it's important to remember that inequality hasn't always been such a fashionable topic. In fact, for much of Tony's career, it was deeply unfashionable. For many decades, the prevailing wisdom on economic inequality could be summed up by two statements. It doesn't matter, and even if it did matter, there isn't much that can or should be done about it. Now, the dominant paradigm during those decades said that if markets were efficient and people were rational, then any inequality of outcomes must occur for some fundamental economic reason, such as the distribution of talent, or maybe preferences for work versus leisure, or the ratio of capital in society, or skills required by the technologies of the era. So while inequality might be of concern for social justice or political reasons, economically it could be viewed as in some ways the natural order of things, and trying to do anything about it was likely to create market inefficiencies, dull incentives, and reduce overall social welfare. So maybe we should worry about poverty and education and those issues, but inequality per se could be pushed to the side. So it's a brave man who dedicates a major part of his career to something that doesn't matter and about which nothing can be done. And those who know Tony know that he is indeed a very brave man. But standing here in 2015 with a bit of perspective, we can firmly say that Tony was right and the prevailing wisdom was wrong. Economic inequality does matter, and much can be done. And that's the argument of his powerful new book, which he's launching tonight, Inequality, What Can Be Done, published by Harvard University Press. Now, I think most of us have heard of a certain other book on this topic, which has helped bring it back into the spotlight. Thomas Piketty's landmark work synthesized a vast quantity of data on the subject and, as we all know, has triggered a global debate. In his book, Piketty drew heavily on the work of Tony and his colleagues such as Facundo Alvarado, and at the recent INET conference in Paris, Piketty acknowledged his tremendous debt to Tony. But while Piketty triggered a much-needed debate, he didn't give us much in the way of solutions. My only comment on Piketty's major policy proposal, a global tax on wealth, is to say that it's a very French proposal. Tony, in his book, gives us his own take on the data and the diagnosis of the problem, but his great and truly unique contribution is he provides a deep analysis and recommendations for a very concrete program of solutions. Many of his bold recommendations will be controversial, particularly in this highly political season. But this is exactly the kind of debate that we very much need. So in order to start us in that discussion, I'm now going to turn it over to Tony. And after Tony speaks, we'll then have responses from two distinguished colleagues, Professor Wendy Carlin and Professor Brian Nolan, who I'll introduce after Tony's remarks. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Sir Tony Atkinson.
Well, thank you very much, Eric, for that very generous introduction, and also, in fact, for setting the scene very well for what I want to say. In fact, I think I can cross off the first of my paragraphs that I had in front of me. You've explained how, from having been a subject not very much discussed by my profession, inequality has now become very much at the forefront of political debate. And there's been enormous both media coverage and, I think, political attention. So, for example, the United States President, Barack Obama, has described rising income inequality as to quote from him, the defining challenge of our time. The Pope has called for governments to redistribute wealth to the poor in a new spirit of generosity. And Christine Lagarde, head of the IMF, has declared that reducing inequality is one of her priorities, since she sees inequality as threatening the sustainability of the world economic system. But what the world leaders have not said is what they would do about it. And there are repeated calls for equitable growth, but little clue as to how that's going to be achieved. And that's the main reason that I embarked on writing the book, Inequality, What Can Be Done. In fact, there seems to be a climate of gloom and doom, a sense that little can be done to reduce inequality. And the most common adjective used to describe Piketty's view of the future is dystopian. And I gather from the dictionary that dystopia is an imaginary place where people are unhappy and usually afraid because they're not treated fairly. Well, my aim is to tell a more upbeat story. The key message is that present levels of inequality are not inevitable, and it's not the case that we're simply at the mercy of forces beyond our control. If we want to reduce inequality, and of course that's a big if, then there are steps that we can take. They're not necessarily easy, and they have costs. And we'd have to discard quite a lot of economic and political orthodoxy. But there are concrete measures that can be tried if we're serious about tackling inequality. At the same time, I should emphasize at the outset that while I make far-reaching proposals, I'm not seeking to go to the opposite extreme, from dystopia to utopia. Rather, I'm concerned with a reduction in inequality below its current level. That is, with the direction of movement, not with the ultimate destination. My reading of current opinion is that many people feel that the present inequality in our societies is excessive, while having possibly quite different views about just how far they would like to see it reduced. So the book is directed at what I see as being a fairly broad coalition, allowing the reader to choose how far they wish to go along the road described. Now, to make the discussion a bit more concrete, what do I mean by economic inequality? It could refer to, for example, what people are paid, the gap between earnings at the top of the distribution and earnings at the bottom. Others, particularly in the debate going on at the moment as part of the general election about the standard of living, may have in mind household disposable income. And these are different concepts. And on the slide, I've shown the stages in going from one to the other. Income is not only pay, although pay is obviously very important for many people, but it's also income from investments, savings and capital, and from transfers like child benefit or retirement pensions. And we have to add these all up to get household income. Moreover, it relates to the income of everyone who lives in the household. So, for example, a vicar, for example, may be not very well paid, but if he or she is married to an investment banker, then the household may be quite well off. And we have to take account of the differing needs of different families. As one of my colleagues used to say, if you have 2 children, then a penny bun costs you 4p. And that's because his wife got one as well. So what in broad terms is the story about household income inequality in the UK? And to answer this, I'm going to show 2 graphs. The first graph shows the evolution of inequality since the Second World War. And the top line, the series marked by bold squares, shows a measure of overall inequality, the extent of income differences between everyone in the population. It gives you a score which ranges from 0, when everyone has the same income, so there's no inequality, to 100% if one person scoops the whole lot. And this summary measure tells you a rather simple story for the United Kingdom. From the early 1960s, broadly when I was a student first studying economics, through to 1980, the coefficient is around 25%. After 1980, it begins to rise, and is now around 35%. There's been a 10 percentage point rise in inequality measured this way. And that's big. And to put it in perspective, if we tried just to use income tax to reduce the Gini coefficient by 10 percentage points, we'd have to raise the basic rate of income tax by something like 16%. And the sheer magnitude of that kind of increase demonstrates that inequality today is higher than a generation ago by a really significant amount. I mean, the Chancellor of the Exchequer would have to take a very deep breath before going to the House of Commons and announcing that income tax is going up by 16p in the pound. Now, you'll note here that I'm taking a longish view. I'm not commenting here on the last 5 years of the coalition government. In fact, there hasn't been much change in this measure. We've been at this higher level of 35% for something like the last 20, 25 years. At the same time, there have been changes in the distribution, and the graph shows what's happened at the top. The share of the top 1%, about which one hears a lot in public discussion, their share has, despite falling somewhat in 2009, more than doubled since 1980. So there's certainly been a racing away at the top of the distribution. And that's something which was highlighted in Piketty's book. But one of the reasons I wrote my own book was I felt we should also be looking not just at the top, but also what happened at the other end of the scale, and what was happening to people on low incomes. And here, in some respects, the record in this country is a little more encouraging. It is true that poverty rose as inequality rose in the 1980s, but since 1990, it has in fact been reduced from its peak in 1990. And that fall, which we must give credit, I think, to successive governments, both the Conservative government and then the Labour government, still, however, leaves poverty in the United Kingdom above the level it was in the 1960s and 70s, a level which was then regarded as profoundly shocking. And the Child Poverty Action Group, for example, was founded in 1965, when the poverty rate in this country was 3% lower than it is today. The second piece of background evidence shows inequality in international perspective. As a result of the post-1980 jump upwards in inequality in this country, we've risen up this league. And this, of course, is a league which, if you're concerned about inequality, you don't want to be near the top. We've risen up to more or less, not a bit short of the United States level. If we were to reduce inequality in Britain by 10 percentage points, then it would make this country, in this respect, more like the Netherlands, a country which we have a lot in common, including an imperial past. Now, this shows the current situation. It shows the effect of the rise that took place since 1980. At the same time, we shouldn't forget, I see already the response to my provocative remarks. in the past, we have seen, in fact, that there have been significant periods when inequality was reduced. It isn't a one-way process. This is particularly true in mainland Europe when, after the Second World War, there was a sustained period of reducing inequality. The Gini coefficient in the country I just mentioned, the Netherlands, fell by 8.5 percentage points between 1959 and 1985. In Finland, the coefficient fell by 11 percentage points in a similar period. In France and Italy by 9 percentage points. So we shouldn't imagine that it is impossible to reduce inequality. But of course, that was a different world. It doesn't follow that the same kind of reduction can be achieved today. And this brings me to the economics of inequality and the standard textbook story about what the reasons are for the increase. Now, economists are often accused of being behind the curve, ignoring the way in which the world is changing in front of our eyes. But this is unfair in the present case. Textbook writers have been quick to include discussion of increased inequality, and you'll find in most introductory books on economics a simple supply and demand explanation. Increased inequality is due to the demand for educated workers rising faster than the supply. 40 years ago, the Dutch economist Jan Tinbergen described a race between education, increasing supply, and technological change biased towards demanding more and more skilled workers. Demand grew faster, and the wage differential widened. And today's story includes another factor shifting demand in this direction, globalisation, which has seen the disappearance of many jobs for low-educated workers. Now, this standard story is accompanied by the policy prescription that is on the lips of most policymakers and commentators. We need, they say, to invest more in education and training. Now, I fully support these calls for investment in human capital. I suppose, having spent a lifetime in higher education, I could hardly do otherwise. But I would like to stress that this, important though it is only part of the story. And what I want to concentrate on this evening is the rest of the story, the other parts of the story. The first way in which it's only part of the story is that these forces of technological change and globalization are not exogenous forces outside our control. We're not simply powerless in the face of events. Most technological advances, such as the smartphone that Eric asked you to turn off, those technological advances reflect decisions that are made by scientists, research managers, businessmen, investors, governments, consumers. And these decisions are influenced by economic considerations. The degree of bias in technological change, whether it favors skilled workers rather than unskilled workers, or whether it favors capital rather than labor, depends on the decisions of firms. But this raises the question as to whether we should leave these decisions then purely to the market. And the answer which I give is no, since the decisions of firms all too often neglect the interests of stakeholders apart from their shareholders. A company, and you can probably think of examples, may, for example, decide to invest in robotizing, I always have difficulty with that word, robotizing its warehouses as in developing delivery of its goods by drones. That would reduce the demand for labor. And the company may indeed be doing it partly for that reason, since it reduces its dependence on a labor force that wants to be properly treated and paid a living wage. One of my proposals is therefore that the direction of technical change should be a matter in which the government should take an active interest. After all, it is the government which has funded much of the underlying research. Just to give one example, one of the people most involved in developing the touch screen, a fundamental part of certain new technologies. That person worked at the Royal Radar Establishment in Malvern. The second reason why the textbook story is only part of it is that there are other important elements that go to make up household incomes. So just going back to the slide I showed you earlier about the elements that go to make up household incomes, we should look not just at the one that's circled. There are other important elements, and those, in fact, are the ones on which I want to focus, and they structure the proposals which I make in the book. There are, in fact, 15 proposals. Now, if you're looking surreptitiously at your watches or at the clock, I can assure you I'm not going to discuss all 15 in detail. What I'm going to do is to discuss them in groups related to the mechanisms described on the slide, 1, 2, 3, and 1, 2, and 3, and to pick out some of them for particular comment. I begin with the welfare state and taxation. One of the factors contributing to the earlier decline in inequality in many European countries was the existence of progressive income taxes and the expansion of the post-war welfare state. But since 1980, there has been an unwinding of redistributive policies in OECD countries with adverse distributional consequences. This is summarized by the OECD Secretary General in his 2011 report, Divided We Stand. He spelled out how from the mid-1990s, the reduced redistributive capacity of tax benefit systems has sometimes been the main source of widening household income inequality. Part of what is needed, therefore, to reduce inequality is to undo some of the post-1980s scaling back of the redistributive state, and that involves raising taxes. Now, raising taxes is never easy, but in this slide I've suggested a series of tax measures addressed towards reducing inequality. The first is a return to progressive income taxation, in the sense that marginal rates of tax, the tax you pay on an extra pound of income, rise systematically with income, with a suggested top marginal rate of 65% on incomes above 200,000 a year, compared with the present 45%. This would represent a partial, and I emphasize only a partial, return to the kind of tax rates that ruled for most of the 20th century. And it would be associated, accompanied by a modest shift of the burden of taxation away from wages towards capital income via a new earned income discount. Next, there would be a major reform of wealth transfer taxation to convert the tax from one based on the amount given to one based on the amount received, which sounds perhaps a rather straightforward change. But it means by taxing people on the amount received over their lifetime in the form of bequests and gifts, we would have essentially a lifetime capital receipts tax, which would underline the fact that the tax is a levy on inherited advantage, and that it would only be paid where that advantage was concentrated. A donor could reduce the tax paid, in fact could reduce it to zero, by dividing his or her estate and sharing it more widely. Now this is, I should say, far from a new idea. It was proposed in the 19th century by John Stuart Mill, someone who was much concerned with individual liberty and who saw, in fact, liberty as being underpinned by, to quote, the diffusion rather than the concentration of wealth. The last proposal is the conversion of council tax into a property tax levied as a percentage of the market value of the property. And I'll just spend a few minutes on this because it's obviously quite topical in terms of the current general election, and because, more importantly, I think, it illustrates how quite large shifts in tax policy can be achieved. Just a bit of history. For many years, local government in this country was financed, as far as households were concerned, from domestic rates, which were related somewhat loosely to property values, or an ability to pay basis. The Conservative government in the 1980s decided to replace this system with a radically different flat rate charge, which popularly became known as the poll tax. The Conservatives justified this on the grounds that the benefit from local services were broadly proportional to the number of people. In other words, the basis of taxation was switched from an ability to pay basis to a benefit basis, quite different basis for taxation. But it was, of course, highly regressive, and the tax provoked at the time widespread opposition, and no doubt many of you remember there were riots in the streets. In time, the Prime Minister, Mrs. Thatcher, resigned, and her successor announced that the poll tax would be abandoned and replaced by the council tax that we have now. And everyone breathed a sigh of relief. We'd got rid of the poll tax. But the council tax is still highly regressive. Houses at the start of the top band H are worth nearly 5 times those at the start of the middle band, but they're only taxed at twice as much. Now, the poll tax was described recently in the book by Tony King and Ivor Crewe as a colossal blunder. But in fact, in terms of Conservative policy, it was a great success. The final outcome was a shift in the underlying principle of local taxation from one based on ability to pay to one based on benefit. And here, in the book, I'm proposing to reverse this shift, which may sound like a big step, but it is precisely what most local governments do in the United States. What about the transfer side? Here I should explain that I began life as a convinced follower of Lord Beveridge, believing that the key principle should be that of social insurance, which was the title of his famous 1942 plan. Now, Beveridge categorically rejected the use of means tests, as in social assistance. He felt strongly that people should be entitled to benefits such as pensions by virtue of contributions, not subject to tests of their income or assets. He hoped that social assistance, which was the residue of the old poor law, would die away and be replaced by social insurance. But this didn't happen. Instead, under successive governments, the means-tested sector has been expanded, most recently in the form of tax credits, to the extent now that I think something like 22 million people are living in households receiving income-tested benefits. Now, that's not all bad. In the case of this country, without the expansion of family income-tested tax credits, the reduction in child poverty would have been less, the reduction in poverty I referred to earlier on, and inequality would have been higher. Means-tested transfers are better than nothing. But the income testing approach is, I think, inherently flawed. Not only does it generate high disincentives in the sense that you lose a substantial fraction of any extra income earned as a result of working more or of saving more. There are high marginal tax rates. But also, means-tested benefits have, throughout this period, failed to reach a significant minority of the intended beneficiaries. In 2010, 17% of those eligible for child tax credit did not claim. 1.2 million families were not benefiting from a program that was supposed to help them. So I think for a sustainable long-term solution, we need to explore alternative routes. So what do I propose? I propose, first of all, a substantial increase in child benefit. Moreover, it should be paid, once again, to all families. But it should be targeted by making it taxable. Here there's a complementarity with the reform proposed for income taxation, in that a basic rate taxpayer would get 80% of the benefit from the child benefit, but the top rate taxpayer would only get 35%. is a kind of inverted income testing. Now, child benefit is a basic income for children. And this brings me to one of the two possible routes for other benefits. The more radical is my version of a citizen's income, which is an aspiration of the Green Party, but where I would depart from what they propose in that eligibility would be based not on citizenship, which I think actually in this context is not a workable way of doing it, but on participation, on taking part in a society, where that would include obviously employment, but other activities like caring for children or elderly people, on participation in that society. Everyone who qualified in that way would receive a basic income called a participation income. Just as today, everyone receives a personal tax allowance. The difference is that the personal tax allowance, which would be abolished, the value of that depends on your income. If you're in the first part of the 40% band, then it's worth £82 a week. If you're in the basic rate band, it's worth half of that. And if your income is below the tax threshold, it's worth still less. What the participation income would do is to replace this by an equal cash amount paid to everyone. Everyone would get the same benefit. Now that sounds like a radical idea, but it's found support in the United States from Nobel Prize winners with very differing views, Milton Friedman on the right and James Tobin on the left. But it's not just taxes and spending. Nearly half of the proposals made in the book are concerned with the market distribution of income. Indeed, one of the key messages is that it's not feasible to achieve a 10 percentage point reduction in overall inequality just by taxes and spending. One can get perhaps nearly halfway, but the other half, or slightly more than half, needs action on earnings and capital incomes. We cannot be, as Tony Blair once said he was, intensely relaxed about what the market throws up in terms of rewards. This means, first of all, tackling unemployment. To me, it's astonishing that this subject is so missing from the public debate. In this country and in Europe, it's not missing from the United States debate. Now, some of the audience looking around will probably remember the 1979 general election, when the Conservatives had one of the most successful bits of political advertising ever, and they had a slogan saying, "Labour isn't working." That's why I've included this graph, courtesy of David Hendry, to remind you there was a time in the post-war era when unemployment was around 1%. I remember at that time the Prime Minister of New Zealand said that in his country he knew all the unemployed. And being a skeptic, I then looked at the figures and discovered there were in fact 55 people unemployed. So it's possible he did. But this shows you that in the days when I was a student of economics, unemployment was 1% or thereabouts. And I remember writing essays saying how terrible it would be if it rose to 2.5%. Today, the rate of 5% is claimed as a great economic success. Now, the first proposal I make under this heading is that the profile should be raised by having an explicit target for unemployment, just as we have an official target, a macroeconomic target, for inflation. Simon Wren-Lewis has recently proposed giving the Bank of England such a dual mandate, where, to quote from him, the objective of achieving the maximum level of employment consistent with the long-term inflation stability is given as much weight as achieving the inflation target. And of course, Mark Carney, current governor of the Bank of England and former Nuffield student, has made a very useful start by introducing unemployment into his discourse. But how would such an ambition of reaching an unemployment target be realized? And here I believe we need a major reconsideration. The measures taken in the past 20 plus years have failed to return us to the low levels of unemployment of the post-war decades. Labour market reform, in inverted commas, as advocated by the OECD and others, has not been the solution. We've seen the power of trade unions greatly reduced. We've seen the level and coverage of unemployment benefit severely curtailed. But we've not found it possible to keep unemployment below 5%. Now, there are obviously many factors we should discuss, but one of them, I think, is that we have focused almost exclusively on the supply side of the labour market and not on the demand. And then in the book, I spent quite a lot of time discussing the demand side of the labour market. And I make the radical proposal that the government should act as an employer of last resort under conditions that I spell out in the book. Now, last resort is usually a phrase applied to saving banks, but it seems to me just as banks may be too important to fail, so too are our citizens. But jobs are only part of the story. The level of pay is also important, as is illustrated by the fact that in the European Union as a whole, half of the unemployed who found jobs didn't earn sufficient in that job to bring them up to the poverty line. There's a serious problem of in-work poverty. And that's why I endorse the campaign for a living wage, which would involve raising the national minimum wage by about 20%. What about capital? Here I should distinguish between capital and wealth, a distinction that I think should have been drawn more clearly in Thomas Piketty's book, where capital appears in the title, but in fact most of it is about wealth. Why is this distinction important? Well, put simply, wealth is now much more evenly spread than it was a century ago. But that does not imply that there has been a corresponding spread of the control over economic decisions associated with capital. A person with a defined contribution pension fund, as probably many people in the room have, is indirectly the beneficiary from the dividends paid on the shares in companies owned by those funds. But they have absolutely no say in what those companies do. I'm the second largest holding in USS, which pays my pension, and I suspect the pension of a number of other people in the room. That second largest holding is in HSBC. But I don't think either I or any other pensioners or any contributors can be held responsible for the actions of HSBC's Swiss tax office. That's why I spend some time in the book exploring the role of countervailing power in terms of rebalancing power among stakeholders. And to this end, there are many steps that could be taken, including introducing distributional considerations into competition policy, ensuring that negotiations about issues such as the TTIP, Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, involve workers and consumer representatives, as well as corporations, and examining whether the legislative balance has in this country swung too far against trade unions. In terms of the ownership of wealth, much of the attention following Piketty's book, and Eric made reference to it, has focused on taxing the rich. But I believe that we should give as much attention to increasing the wealth of small savers, looking not just at the top, but also the rest, the middle, and the rest of the population. And that's why I propose the reintroduction of index-linked bonds for small savers. Piketty talked about R, the rate of return. I said, by the way, there are no equations in the book, but if I can just be allowed to use two symbols. R, the rate of return, he was talking about exceeding G, the rate of growth. But for many small savers, this is rather puzzling, since for them, for many years, R has been less the rate of growth. Indeed, for most of the last 5 years, the return to small savings has been negative in real terms. And the proposal for index-linked bonds guaranteeing at least G in excess of inflation, as used to be offered in this country, but has been withdrawn, would do much to help the accumulation of wealth by small savers. A step that should find support on the right as well as the left of the political spectrum. Equally, there may be wide-ranging support for the proposal that the revenue from the wealth transfer tax that I talked about a few minutes ago, that the revenue from that should be used to fund a minimum inheritance for all on reaching the age of 18. After all, there's nothing wrong with inheritance as such. The problem is that many inherit very little and some inherit a great deal. Then there is the proposal for a sovereign wealth fund. I shouldn't forget the deficit. But the slide I'm going to show you focuses on a different aspect, one that does receive very little attention in the discussion about the public finances. It focuses on the overall asset position of the state, looking not just at the national debt, what the state owes, but also at the state assets. And it's always seemed to be absurd that we talk about the national debt without considering what the state owns. It's like saying to someone, well, if you've got a large mortgage, and ignoring the fact they've got a large house, which they own. In the same way, it's, I think, absurd to talk about selling Lloyds Bank shares as reducing the national debt, and to ignore the fact it's taking away, reducing the state assets that we own. And the graph tells, in this respect, a rather sad story. After the war, the state gradually restored its net worth position, and by 1979, the net worth of the state was some 75% of national income. So it was substantially plus. But then, following the privatizations of the 1980s, the net worth fell sharply, and by 1997, it was once again close to zero. So what I propose is that we should be concerned with this overall asset position, and that the state assets should be brought together in a sovereign wealth fund and fiscal policy designed to build up state net worth. This is not, I should hasten to say, nationalization, but rather the acquisition of beneficial ownership, with the medium-term goal that the state would benefit from the rise in the share of profits that may happen as a result of macroeconomic developments. As it was put by Laura Tyson in America in a debate about technological change, she says the implications of the spread of robots depends crucially on who owns them. And if the state, which after all has paid for much of the development, gets a significant chunk of the profits, then the distributional outcome will be quite different. Now, I've gone rapidly through 15 proposals, and there's lots to discuss. The New Yorker said in its article last month that my proposals would not work in the United States. Well, people have short memories. In 1978, the US Congress passed the Humphrey Hawkins Full Employment and Balanced Growth Act, authorizing the president to form a reservoir of public employment, an employer of last resort. Going further back, the Republican Senator Sherman moved his Antitrust Act because he believed that nothing, to quote from him, was more threatening than the inequality of wealth. And there are today conservative supporters for example, a sovereign wealth fund. And I couldn't help resist adding, and Premier League football clubs have signed up to the living wage. Now, of course, these proposals are debatable. And on the final slide, I have simply sketched some of the very obvious objections and my responses to them. They're the subject of part 3 of the book, which ends by considering the way forward. In the first slide, which I think you barely had a chance to see, I quoted Keynes about us living dominated by a pessimistic view of the world. And I've tried in this talk and in the book to be more optimistic. So while I have stressed the importance of looking back in time, to times when perhaps inequality was less, I don't believe that we've gone back to a world like that when Queen Victoria was on the throne. The citizens of OECD countries today enjoy a standard of living that is much higher than that of their great-grandparents. The achievement of a less unequal society in many countries after the Second World War has not been fully overthrown. And at a global level, the great divergence between countries associated with the Industrial Revolution is undoubtedly closing. It is true that since 1980 we have seen an inequality turn, the big step up in inequality I described at the beginning. And it's also true that the 21st century brings challenges that I've simply ignored, like population aging and climate change. But the solution to these problems lie in our own hands. If we are willing to use today's greater wealth to address these challenges, and if we accept that resources should be shared less unequally, there are indeed, I think, grounds for optimism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tony. I think it's appropriate that as you began your remarks, we could hear the mob rising in the streets. And then they dissipated as soon as you got into the solution, so it clearly was working. I'd now like to introduce for a response, first, Wendy Carlin, a professor of economics at UCL and also a visiting professor of economics here at Oxford. And Wendy is also the leader of the core curriculum development effort, which is supported by INET. And then Wendy will be followed by Brian Nolan, who's a professor of social policy here at Oxford and also the director of the Employment, Equity, and Growth Program at the INET Oxford Center. So first, Wendy.
It's a great honor to be here, and I want to begin by suggesting that there was a font error in the design of the book, because the really distinctive feature of what Tony's done is captured by this. Inequality, what can be done? And he even goes as far as, and how can it be done? I think the book is really a celebration of economics and how it can contribute to political action. It's an optimistic and pragmatic view of possibilities ahead. What Tony does is he shows that technology can be harnessed to improve the quality of life across the income distribution. It's very optimistic about economics. It shows that good economics documents the facts about inequality, and we've had a very nice run-through of the major, many of the important dimensions in Tony's talk. That economics clarifies where there are trade-offs, and the book uses the leaky bucket story very effectively. And Tony spends a lot of time talking about the fact that there's no necessary trade-off between equity and efficiency, that they can be complements, and that policy can be brought to bear to bring about improvements in efficiency at the same time as supporting a dynamic economy. And economics also quantifies the possible, and that's very evident when you move towards the latter parts of the book. So it's not just about documenting the past, but it's about quantifying policies that can be implemented. And the third really striking feature of this book is that it's about courageous politics. And it's that politics is required to build support for a new vision of a just and dynamic society. And that kind of rings through from page after page. So what I thought I'd do was just provide some different way of looking at the book, at inequality, what can be done. And this is just a way of thinking about the factors influencing economic inequality that Tony runs through in the book. So we think of technology affecting economic inequality directly, but also affecting it through what we can think of as differences in endowments. These are all the things that affect an individual's capacity to earn market income. So wealth, human capital, and so on. And the ultimate economic inequality, as Tony pointed out, is what's happening in the household after taxes and transfers. What this picture doesn't show you is the intergenerational story, so there should be arrows appearing out at the right-hand end here, because we're also very interested in the way economic inequality feeds back into the next generation. So, okay, this is a format problem. It wasn't supposed to cross out what can be done. That's just to see if you're still awake at the back. This was an underlining of what can be done. So the first what can be done is number one, which is, I think, a very original part of the book, which is the argument that institutions and policy can be directed towards influencing technology, and as we can see from the picture, technology has its effects through changing endowments and directly onto inequality. Institutions and policy can affect endowments and can also affect inequality through taxes and transfers. So this technology argument, I found very gripping in the book. So the idea that the enhanced robot capability that now seems to be emerging, so robots can now apparently climb stairs, which they were unable to do a very short time ago. And we can think about this as leading to a bifurcation of the skilled labour market, the previously skilled labour market, if you like, into the engineers who are running the robots, and then care sector workers. And this has an effect on inequality through changes in relative wages and in the endowments, the things that allow people to earn market income. So both of these tracks. And here, I'm just going to use a representation of inequality that Tony's used. My one equation has halved the size of the audience, but I just want you really to look at the picture because this is a measure that comes through again and again in the book, and it's a very simple one to grasp. So everyone is lined up here along the bottom in order of their income from lowest to highest, and the share of total income is up the vertical axis. So a situation in which income was equally distributed would be captured by the dashed line, the line of equality. And how far away an economy is from equality is shown by the Lorenz curve and really by the size of the area A, and that's what the focus should be on. So I just wanted to visualize, if you like, the inequality by looking at the unemployed workers and owners and pointing out that the analysis of Piketty has very much focused at the right-hand side, right up the top there, what's happening to the share of wealth and income that owners have. Tony's focus in the book is across the whole distribution. And if we think about robots and job polarization, this is just a very stylized example, then we can think about this having the effect of increasing capital share if the ownership of the robots remains highly concentrated, a point Tony referred to at the end of his talk. That workers with skills complementary to robots gain, and you can see that Lorenz curve being pulled out, and that area between the Lorenz curve and the line of equality getting bigger. At least in the short run, workers with skills complementary to robots lose. So this is what could happen in a robotized economy. And what the book is pointing to is the mechanisms, the policies that are available to us to take advantage of what robots can offer without having these consequences for inequality. So if productivity rises in both the robot using and the robot producing sectors, then there's really great potential for higher living standards. But the question is how to shape the benefits of robots and how to share the benefits of robots. So if you get to about the middle of the book, then you'll get to this very nice story that Tony tells. This is a drone. So the question is, what is the drone doing? And Tony knows the answer, and I can see how many people have got this far in the book. So the drone is delivering Meals on Wheels. And the point that Tony's making in the book is that that we have to take control over the use of new technology, and the way we don't want it to be developing is to be developing Meals on Wheels delivering drones. Okay, so this is, I think, a very clear insight from the book that we should be shaping robot use in the final goods and services sector. And the other side of that is that the labour that's released through the having robots engaged in robot-suitable activities should be able to be deployed in well-paid jobs in the labour-absorbing or human services where the human touch is required. And the point is that there's no automatic market mechanism to achieve either of these, and that's really the policy thrust of the book. So the policy proposals affect the direction of technology. That's proposal 1, explicit government policy in terms of the direction of technological innovation. Endowment, so I've just listed some of the proposals here. The policy framework to shift the balance of power from owners to workers, relating to competition policy, but also to the trade union rights. And another one I've listed, number 6, capital endowment at adulthood. And then the third category to affect post-tax and transfer incomes, and the one I've particularly flagged is the participation income. So, as Tony pointed out, we should be optimistic. A government-led reduction in inequality has happened before, and the question is this time different? So, during the Second World War and for 2 decades, we had this period of historically high growth and falling inequality. So there was no trade-off. Living standards grew rapidly and inequality fell. For Piketty, this was an aberration in his long-run dystopian view, as Tony put it. For Tony, on the other hand, this is grounds for optimism. And one can think of the role of the post-war accords in allowing workers to benefit from rising productivity at very low unemployment. This is not automatic. It was an outcome of policy and of political struggles. So the Atkinson proposals start from the weakened market and institutional position of workers and seek a reversal. And there are political grounds for optimism. These are data from the US, but in the US, at least 80% of households have less than the average wealth, average net worth. So we can think of a political constituency, a very substantial one, in favour of redistribution. But we also know that under the pressure of lengthy low unemployment and a growing welfare state, the Accords collapsed, the crisis of stagflation followed, and policies were introduced that shifted the balance of power away from workers. So the questions are a set of policies that boost the bargaining power of workers compatible with very low unemployment, 1 to 2%, as Tony suggests. Is a new egalitarian turn to be based mainly on individual rights due to their improved fallback positions achieved through Atkinson-type reforms? And that would be rather different from the post-war accords. And are we thinking about how serious are the proposals that action may be taken at company level? And here we have gravity payments. You may have seen this in the press last week, where one company, the CEO, announced a new minimum wage of $70,000 a year. This caused astonishment to everyone in the company, including the workers, who were utterly delighted but astounded. And what's interesting is that this CEO took his decision after reading research by economists, Kahneman and Angus Deaton. And this takes me to my last point. I think this book is a message of optimism, not only about the economy, but about economics as a tool to galvanize political action, as well as to enlighten. And as a response, we, the teachers, need to teach our students to evaluate fairness as well as efficiency when they're studying economics. So that's where I'll stop.
Well, as you'll have realized by now, and I'm only emphasizing, this is a remarkable book and contribution from a remarkable scholar. And I must say it's a real privilege and pleasure for me to have the opportunity to just briefly highlight some of the key features that you've already heard about, and maybe spark some discussion on specific aspects of the proposals and of the underlying thinking. And really, unashamedly and unabashedly, to urge you to read the book and tell your friends. So the book takes as its point of departure that inequality has been increasing in rich countries now over a prolonged period, as was evidenced in Tony's presentation for the UK. And the first thing to say is that this is now widely accepted, but it's not so long ago that it certainly wasn't. And that's in no small measure thanks to the painstaking accumulation of evidence that Tony has done so much to promote. And the other starting point for the book, again, that we haven't heard much of until recently, or even recently, is the stated belief that the present level of inequality is simply excessive. So concern about rising inequality has been a feature now for some years before the crisis, but often motivated by reference to the range of economic, social, and political problems that may go with rising inequality or be produced by it. While certainly acknowledging and mentioning those, the book argues that there are intrinsic reasons for believing that inequality is excessive, which may be framed in terms of a theory of justice. And here, where Wendy ended, is, I think, absolutely the point, that we need economic students, and much more generally, we need to see much more about fairness and the underlying theoretical frameworks that allow us to think about fairness and have that firmly front and center in the debate, as well as the extrinsic or instrumental reasons for being concerned about increasing inequality. So when Tony says in a typically pithy way that it matters that, quote, that some people can travel to the moon while others are queuing for food banks, we can and should be concerned about inequality, even if reducing it will not necessarily and directly work to the benefit of the poor, although it should be emphasized that the proposals articulated so clearly in the book would certainly do so. So the book is at pains to highlight the extent of the gaps and limitations in our knowledge, particularly when one goes beyond the conventional textbook accounts, so on which so much of the debate, as Tony brought out in his comments, is based, which is relying on assumptions that simply don't stand up to scrutiny. So the problem, it's a classic case of it's not so much what we don't know as what we know that just ain't so, is central to the way these issues get debated and framed. So this is brought out very effectively in the very subtle discussion in the book of the impact of globalisation and technology on earnings, a discussion of the labour market as a social institution, and of the relationship between the structure of taxation and economic growth, in which these conventional understandings, common not just in the political debate, but in economic analysis, are very effectively unpicked. Another striking feature of the book, as you will have gathered, is the long-term perspective that's adopted. And it's really striking just how many insights this perspective yields into how we should think about inequality, and indeed how we should think about the feasible. So based on this very careful teasing out and elaboration of key economic relationships, the book presents a remarkably broad set of proposals that you will have seen. Strikingly, taken together, they constitute a strategy, because it's very clear that the scale of this problem is much too great, of this challenge, to be tackled by even an effective tax and transfer redistributive policy. And that's brought out very effectively in the book and in Tony's remarks. I was interested to hear Eric characterize Tony and the book as brave, because that's the word I have written down here. Not in the sense that Sir Humphrey used the term in putting it to Minister and Prime Minister Hacker and meaning you would be mad to do this, but brave in the sense that some of the proposals, the reaction will be that they're in some sense outlandish. And one can think particularly, for example, of the employment guarantee. But it's the fact that we think about this as outlandish that's the really interesting thing. Because as Tony brought out in his presentation and very effectively in the book, this is a notion that has had real currency and has been mainstream in some societies at some times. And I think that's also true of quite a proportion of the other proposals. That while the package can be described as radical and is certainly radical in intent, many of the constituent elements have actually either been implemented in some form or certainly very seriously examined and considered in some form or another in other countries or at other times. The book is again distinctive in the extent to which it identifies and addresses the main strands of the objections that will be raised to the proposals. And perhaps a subject for discussion is the reaction to a significant proportion will be, that was then and this is now. This is a different world in which we're living, and that renders some of these proposals infeasible or no longer feasible. The book tackles this head on, but I'm sure it'll come up repeatedly in discussion, including perhaps today. So many of the proposals are very fully worked out and their impacts assessed, in particular the tax and transfer package, which is fully simulated and costed using the Euromod technology, very helpfully supported by Holly Sutherland and her colleagues. And that's very helpful in having those proposals taken as seriously as they should and need to be. But I think some of the other proposals, and in particular the discussion that Wendy highlighted about technology and about pay, that also merits very deep consideration. And while the tax and transfer proposals may well get a significant proportion of the immediate attention, it would be, given where we are in the electoral cycle and so on, it would be a real shame if they obscured the importance of the message about technological change, that it reflects social and economic decisions that are amenable to influence. And that's also true of the structure of pay. And perhaps what we again could very fruitfully discuss is how can, if these are amenable to influence, how can that influence be most effectively brought to bear? What are the levers that policymakers can rely on in trying to influence the direction of technological change and in trying to produce a pay structure that would be much more acceptable? Another point I'd emphasize is that while some of the specific proposals are framed in a UK context, most obviously, again, the tax and transfer elements, the thinking underlying in them, the diagnosis of the problem and its causes, and the broad shape of the response really apply across the countries of the rich world to a great extent. Again, with differences due to national settings and contexts and institutions that will be interesting to tease out. So the book, as you will have realized, is written with Tony's characteristic crystalline prose, no equations, as he promised. It would be invidious to draw comparisons with any recent books in this territory. I certainly wouldn't dream of doing so, but this book will be finished by those who start it. It represents a challenge to the political system and its capacity to take big ideas seriously, a challenge to those advocating for greater equality to effectively put the case for its different elements, even in the face of the sort of reactions I've talked about. It represents a real challenge to those who dismiss the proposals as unrealistic or misguided to engage with the arguments and the evidence that underpin each of the elements. And it's a challenge to the discipline of economics to embrace the ideas and approach it adopts. Tony must sometimes feel like the character in the play who discovered he was speaking prose all along, in that Tony has been practicing new economics all along. So above all, the book challenges the notion that, as Wendy brought out very effectively as well, it challenges the notion that increasing inequality is driven by inexorable economic forces about which nothing can be done. The flyer that the publishers handed around includes the reference that Thomas Piketty made to Tony as the godfather of research on inequality economics. It's a little bit hard to see Tony in the Don Corleone or Tony Soprano mold, but it remains the case that his unique combination of depth of knowledge and understanding of this field, capacity, indeed stubborn insistence on thinking for himself, regardless of fad or fashion, academic or otherwise, and deep commitment. That's what has equipped him to explode that belief so effectively and offer a hopeful response. So I very much hope that this book gets the reception that it so richly deserves. Thank you.
If I could ask Tony and Wendy, and we're going to have as an incentive to stay, we're going to have a bit of Q&A. We're running a little bit over on time, but if you can stay, I'm sure we'll have a lively Q&A, and then there are drinks and refreshments afterwards to reward you for your diligence. Now we have some roving microphones that'll go around, so I'm going to take questions in batches. We'll probably take 3 at a time, and then let our speakers address them. So the gentleman in the green shirt in the front, there's a microphone coming.
Thank you. Does tackling the deficit limit the progress that can be made in tackling inequality?
Right, and an excellent example of a good, concise question. I would ask the other questioners to follow that excellent example. Next question. Lady over there.
I just wanted to ask, why was there so little talk about the inequality of opportunity, which is, in my view, much more important than the inequality of outcomes, since one could counteract the other if it were there. I guess if I have to keep going.
Okay, maybe we could take one more, and then I'll turn it over to the panel. In the back on the right. Thank you, Stefan.
I have a question. Yes, can you hear me? So Charlie Mary likes to talk about this problem through a slightly different lens of giving humans dignity, or allowing for them to have dignity. And I was wondering if you had thought about that issue and whether your policy prescriptions in the book might differ if that were your primary objective as opposed to reducing inequality.
Those are all excellent questions. So we have, how does the deficit constrain us in action on this? Inequality of opportunity versus inequality of outcome, and a different lens looking at this problem from the question of human dignity. Tony, do you want to start with your thoughts?
They are indeed good questions and very, very different ones. I'll take them in reverse order. I mean, I think the issue of our dignity is, in fact, a very much what lies behind why I am concerned with our current social security system being heavily reliant on means-tested benefits, which I think implicitly certainly mean that people are not claiming these benefits because they regard them, and it's partly because perhaps they're too complicated, but certainly it's in part because they regard receipt of these benefits as demeaning. And indeed, one of the purposes of the proposals about social security, either a basic income or social insurance, is in fact to remove one element which I think certainly causes a loss of self-respect amongst people who are receiving these particular income-tested benefits. So I think that is, in that sense, is very much in the direction of something which I agree with you is certainly we need to take as part of a wider concept of people's state of well-being is very much how they perceive their treatment and their sense of, as you put it, of dignity. So I think in many respects it would be another reason for some of the things that I'm proposing. The issue, and this leads naturally to the question about inequality of opportunity. And in fact, in the beginning of the book, I spent a few pages discussing precisely this question, because I think you're quite right in saying that many people, if you stop them in the street, will think immediately about inequality of opportunity rather than inequality of outcome. But, and that's something which I share fully, in the sense that I think that inequality of opportunity is very important. But that doesn't mean that inequality of outcome is unimportant, because for several reasons, the most important one probably is that without or with excessive inequality of outcome, it's very difficult to achieve inequality of opportunity. And that's most simply seen in terms of the intergenerational relationship. That is, the inequality of outcome for one generation creates inequality of opportunity for the next generation. So I think that the reasons for concern about inequality of outcome are partly because it's a means of achieving lessening inequality of opportunity. And then the deficit, well, the book was written with not necessarily just the next year or so in mind, and I was rather leaving on one side the issue of the current levels of deficit, but of course they are very much bound up with the issues that I've stressed, which is the need to look at the public accounts in the full, looking at the asset side as well as the liability side, and that's why I certainly envisage that the long-term or medium-term fiscal responses needed to be such as to restore the net worth of the public sector, and that indeed may certainly involve a mix of fiscal measures. My own preference would be for that mix to be much more heavily towards raising taxes and less towards cutting expenditure. And it's worth bearing in mind that we have substantially cut taxes, particularly taxes on income in this country over the last 15, 20, 25 years. We've financed that to a considerable extent by asset sales. And as a result of that, those asset sales not only, well, we're running out of capacity to do that, but also that reversing that would then mean bringing taxes back to the kind of levels that we had before we used asset sales to fund the deficit.
Thank you, Tony. Brian and Wendy, anything to add to those points? Or should we go for another round of questions? Gentleman in the way back on the right. Yeah, behind you, Stefan. Gentleman with the glasses. Sorry. We'll come back to you. We'll come back to you, sir.
Right.
Yeah, that's okay.
Sorry.
Should take your glasses off, I think.
We're trying to create equality of opportunity in asking questions.
Yeah, I don't think you'd like the look of me.
Right.
My question was about tax evasion and tax avoidance, and whether you had anything to say about that as a problem, because I think over the last 20, 30 years seen a huge, obviously, expansion and deregulation and kind of laissez-faire approach to the financial sector, and as a result, a lot of these policies will be quite hard to implement because a lot of things are avoided. So I was just wondering if you had anything to say about that problem linked to taxes and transfers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Other question? Gentleman in the red, just on the other side of the aisle there.
Thank you. I was wondering, in regards to competition policy, what specific measures could be taken towards more inequality? So is it that authorities should explicitly investigate markets where, let's say, collusion or abusive dominance affect people that are in the lower end with a lower income? That's one question. And the second is, what difficulties can that change have if the people that enforce competition policy are people that normally tend towards efficiency of markets, so to be pro-market, just because they're interested precisely in competition policy?
Great, thank you. Yeah, we'll take one more. There's another one in the back there. Yeah.
Can I ask what kind of policies you have in mind regarding the distribution of profits from technological change? And are they the sort of policies that can be taken up by a single government acting on its own?
Right. I don't spend a lot of time discussing tax avoidance and tax evasion. I mean, that is, I think it's an important subject, but it's been discussed, for example, quite a lot by Thomas Piketty in his book, and his student, Gabriel Zuckman, has a book coming out about tax havens, which I recommend to you, and I don't know enough about that. I also think that it's quite easy, as it were, to pencil in fiscal savings under the heading of reducing tax avoidance and evasion as part of your deficit reduction programs without actually any concrete suggestions how that's going to be achieved. So I was wary of counting in my budgetary calculations anything from that. But I fully agree. I think most people also, I think, most people are now much more aware of this as an issue. And I think also there's been a shift. Wendy talked about, to some extent, about the shifts that have taking place in the public opinion. But clearly one shift I think has taken place is a sense that it's not just tax evasion, but also that it's various forms of tax avoidance are now no longer morally acceptable. And that's, I think, I'm quoting, I think they are the Prime Minister. So I think that there has been a shift in that, which will certainly make it easier for tax authorities to carry out their activities. On the other hand, of course, they need the resources to do that, and one of the things I do refer to in the book is the fact that that is one area where the employment is, Wendy referred to the care sector as an employment growth area, but it's also, of course, public administration. I mean, public administration, to carry out a tax system in a highly complex, globalized world requires substantial resources being spent on public administration. And I think that's something which our politicians have not been willing to defend. I think they ought to, because we do need to spend money on running our societies. We're a rich society, we can afford to run it properly. The competition policy is a very interesting question. I think I make two responses. One is that you, I think, correctly identified there was a shift that took place in the United States with regard to competition policy from the days when Sherman first introduced it, and then judgments like those of Judge Learned Hand, for example, I think in the 1940s, thereabouts, which recognized that there was a distributive element to it, has been replaced by an emphasis on purely efficiency. On the other hand, I have noticed recently a succession of papers coming across my screen by lawyers at the University of Chicago, University of Chicago Law School, who are in fact questioning this and arguing that indeed competition policy should take a much broader view of its purposes. And then to be more precise and give you an example, I think, for instance, the impact of competition policy on the availability of goods and services is very important. And it's one of the ironies that competition policy has had the effect, certainly in this country, of reducing the availability of banking services. There are many places where banks are closing because they've been told to do so under competition policy, and people are not therefore recognizing that there are other considerations apart from those traditionally which form part of the competitive analysis. And then the technical change, I mean, that is indeed, well, it's a difficult question to answer, partly because it's obviously quite difficult to predict what the issues are going to be. But just to give you an example, I mean, it's very noticeable that the emphasis in developing driverless cars, for example, has been entirely on the efficiency considerations and none at all on the implications that might have for the demand for labour. And much of that, of course, is funded by, in the United States, by government funding. Some of it is funded by Google. So I think that that's an example of where one needs to ask the questions about what areas should we be doing research to improve productivity, and there is therefore a difference between allocating it, in that case, to reducing the demand for drivers. In other cases, it may be to increase the productivity of workers, which, for example, might well apply in many of the areas involving personal services. So I think that I'm posing a question rather than giving you an answer. That is, I say we should be thinking about this and not, as at the moment seems to be the case, completely ignoring it. So I think if you ask the Minister for Science, if we have such a thing as still, what is the impact of his or her policies on the distribution of income, my guess is they look completely blank.
Thank you, Tony. Now, I'm just keeping an eye on the time, and we're getting near the end here, and so I'd like to invite Brian or Wendy to have any final comments, either on these questions or any just final words of wisdom. Yeah?
No, I think we've had a fair run.
Okay. In that case, it just leaves it to me to, first of all, congratulate Tony again on this excellent and important book, which I hope you will all buy and, unlike some other books on this topic, actually read. And second, to thank Wendy and Brian for their contributions. And also, I'd like to thank Harvard University Press, Tony's publisher, who very kindly provided sponsorship for the drinks, which are just next door, which I invite you all to enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you.